Good afternoon. This is the December 2022 monthly presentation of the Institute for Historical Study. And I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for today, who is author Robert Aquinas McNally, who first confronted the California Genocide when he was researching his book, The Modoc War, published by Bison Books, University of Nebraska Press, and discovered that the conflict's true narrative was something other than the cowboys and Indians plot he expected. The book went on to win a Commonwealth Club gold medal as the year's best on California. He is now completing Cast Out of Eden, the untold story of John Muir, Indigenous peoples, and the American wilderness, also for Bison Books. So now I will turn it over to Robert. There will be a small gap because we missed the first minute or so of Robert's presentation, unfortunately.
And then in 2016 came this book. Wait a minute, what's going on now? American Genocide by Benjamin Madley. So the United States in the California Indian Catastrophe from 1846 to 1873. And Madley has got a really, really thorough look at what happened in the state. He goes year by year by year by year and accounts for what occurred, what sorts of actions were being taken against the indigenous tribes and nations of California. And it's a little bit like getting caught up in you feel like you're in an avalanche. The book he's not a particularly graceful or marvelous writer, but there is such a stunning recitation of data about this killing here and this story here and this massacre and this series of murders. And it just keeps going on and on and on. And it's quite a devastating book. So I'm going to dig now into the background to these two things and talk about what's set up and how it came to be that California stands out as the state with a state genocide. And it begins really with this man, Peter Burnett, whom you may well know was the first civilian governor of California. And on January the 7th of 1851, Burnett gave his State of the State address to the California legislature. And he focused more than anything else on what he called, quote, the Indian problem. And he proposed that the new state take care of the issue for once and for all. There was a growing sense that there was a large level of violence from Indians and something had to be done about it. This is what he said. And at this time, the word extermination stands in for what we would call genocide. The two races must ever remain at enmity, that a war of extermination will continue to be waged until the Indian race becomes extinct must be expected. The inevitable destiny of the indigenous race is beyond the wisdom or power of the white man to avert. Now, this is the kind of the centerpiece of that particular very, very long address. Burnett was something of a windbag, but this particular quotation really stood out. And he was actually criticized for that speech, but not for this particular statement. It really had to do with his inability to talk at anything like a short length. He went on and on and on and on. And for reasons that are still unclear, Burnett decided to resign the governorship 2 days later after giving this speech. But that didn't make any change didn't change the course of the events that were to come. His successor, John McDougal, who had been the lieutenant governor, picked right up where Burnett left off. And what he did was send a memo to the state legislature asking them to begin financing, to produce money in order to pay for militias to hunt down and kill Native people. This is an example of the kind of bond that was put up at this time in the state of California. And if you look real closely at it, you'll see it says there it's for war indebtedness and talks about expeditions against the Indians. And the state of California put up $1.5 million in bonds like this, or raised that much money, and then put this expenditure out to finance militias whose job it was to hunt down and kill native people in this state. To give you a notion of how much money that is now, it would be about $51 million. And this issue of Indian extermination was the leading line item in the state budget of the state of California all the way through the 1850s. And what it tended to look like was this. This is a drawing done by J. Ross Brown, who was a Treasury official who was out here looking into where money was going. And he was really kind of appalled by what he was seeing. And he drew this illustration of the way he saw the militias work. And what they would do was go out they would locate an Indian village, go out during the night and surround the village quietly. And as the sun came up, they would begin firing into the village using rifles. This was, of course, the era of black powder. So the rifle barrels would foul within a matter of like 6 to 8 rounds. So when that began to happen, they put down their rifles and went into the village using pistols, tomahawks, and knives. This was a standard operating procedure. They would typically kill everyone except generally some of the children and particularly young women. And that was because they were actually sold into what amounted to slavery in this state. These militias were, calling them militias which has that notion of a popular armed force that is somehow defending a homeland, isn't quite right. They were really death squads. The Modocs, for example, were targeted by, which I found in my book, was they were targeted by several raids in the early 1850s that killed off a substantial portion of the tribe's population. In each case, when a militia would go out and do these killings, they were able to bill the state for their time and materials. So any weapons, food, horses, guns, so forth, that was all paid for. By the standards of the time, they actually did well. You could make more money killing Indians than you could mining gold for example, up around Yreka, up in the northern part of the state at that time. At the same time that this is going on, the native people in the state are being pushed to the bottom of the economy and out to the edges. So there's all kinds of issues with losing their ability to feed themselves, bad nutrition, disease, bad living conditions. And you can sort of see what's going on for the whole state of California with what happened to the Modocs. In 1846, when the United States took over California, the Modocs numbered as many as 2,000 people. By 1873, that nation had a population of only about 300. There were, after the Modoc War, there were 153 surviving Modocs who were exiled to Oklahoma to a reservation, and only 88 of them had survived by 1889. So that number of people was nearly halved. In California as a whole, the native population was 150,000 in 1846. By 1873, it was down to 30,000. So that means almost 80% of the population had been killed off in that 18-year period, or 28-year period. And it fell even further to a little over 15,000 by 1900. Now, no one in the 19th century would have called this, they would have called it an extermination, but they wouldn't have called it a genocide. And extermination, of course, is an illegal concept, and genocide is. And you couldn't have used the word genocide to describe what happened in California in those years for the simple reason that the word didn't exist. It came into being because of this man, Raphael Limkin. He was a Polish international lawyer. He was a Jew by background. And when the Nazis invaded Poland in 1939, he was able to get out of the country, eventually made his way to the United States. And he had already been fascinated by the dilemma of what he called one community making war, or actually trying to exterminate another community, and had been originally drawn to this whole legal question in the behavior of the Ottoman Empire towards the Armenians. Not the Ottoman Empire, excuse me, the modern Turkey, and then taking out the whole Armenian population. And he realized there was no particular way in law to describe this. And in fact, if a sovereign nation decided to make to exterminate one of its own minorities. There was no particular way within international law to do a doggone thing about it. That's just the way it was. And he recognized in the Nazi state a particularly diabolical expression of this idea of one community wiping out another community. And he wrote this book, The Axis Rule in Occupied Europe. And in it, he defined what we now call genocide. He took two words, two Latin roots, genus, which means race or tribe, and cedere, or cedere in a more modern pronunciation, which means to kill. And he put them together and created the word genocide, for the killing of a people. And he wanted to create, Limkin wanted to create a legal structure that would allow the identification and the prosecution of genocide as a way of trying to prevent it from happening. And he was a absolutely tireless lobbyist. He just worked himself to the bone, lobbying the United Nations after World War II to get what this is the result of all that work. This is the Rome Statute, which was passed in, excuse me, this is not the Rome Statute. This is a United Nations General Assembly resolution that was incorporated into the Rome Statute in 1998. And it defines what we now call genocide. And it's important because this definition has become the one also used by historical scholars to decide what is or is not a genocide. And if you look at the language here, there are two pieces to the whole definition. And let's assume that you are a prosecutor in the International Criminal Court, which is the one that handles this kind of thing. And you would have to establish, if you got somebody up on a genocide claim, say in Darfur or Rwanda, or perhaps one of these days in Ukraine, how would you be able to, what would you have to do to prove that this was a genocide? And there's two pieces you've got to show. The first one is intention. You'll notice that first clause, any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. So there has to be a demonstration of intention. And the second proof you have to do is to show that there were these actions taken that were used to effect that intention to destroy. And you see there's a whole series of things that range from outright murder to forcibly transferring children from one group to another group. So this is how we think of genocide. This is the legal definition of genocide. It's the one that most historical scholars use for defining what a genocide is or isn't. I think that, I know when I first encountered this, that applying the word genocide to what happened in California seemed like a strange stretch. And I realized it had to do with the reality that we tend to think about genocide in terms that are consistent with what happened in the 20th and perhaps early 21st century. So think about some of these classic genocides, like the Nazi Holocaust or the Cambodian Khmer Rouge or Rwanda, in which there were large numbers of people killed. The Holocaust took out at least 6 million Jews plus Slavs and so forth. There was up to 17 million people. The Khmer Rouge killed as many as 2.2 million, and Rwanda also up to about 1 million people. And these all also occurred relatively rapidly. The Holocaust is the longest one there. It took from 1938 to 1945. The Khmer Rouge is in for 4 years. And Rwanda is amazingly fast. It just basically goes from early spring into midsummer and kill that many people. That's kind of the way we think now of genocides. And also we tend to have a cast that comes out from the Holocaust and thinking about these industrial methods of killing people, like the killing camps like Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. But remember that genocide has to do with the intention and the things that were done. And what happened in California differs in particular ways. Instead of lasting just from a few months to a few years, directed by a central agency and often an autocratic government, and achieved by stunning levels of mass murder, the California genocide took a lot longer. It went from at least 1846 to 1873. And there was an epilogue, sort of a kind of continuing level of high mortality among Native peoples. up to 1900. It was pretty much do it yourself with state and federal funding. A killing here, a killing there, a massacre there, disease and poverty everywhere. And the thing that makes this particularly stand out for California is that if you look at the whole history of American history towards Native peoples and Native Americans, you can find lots of incidents of genocides, generally smaller, generally restricted to one place. I mean, one particular horrific event, like, for example, Sand Creek in Colorado, or Wounded Knee in South Dakota, or the Marias Massacre in Montana. But what makes California really set it up is that it was the whole state had this genocidal policy right from the beginning. And it really raises a huge question of why did it happen here? It wasn't that the political culture here was particularly markedly different from anywhere else in the United States. So what is it that made California unique, that it becomes the one state where you can really say that there was indeed a state-sponsored genocide? So to get that idea, we first have to kind of roll the calendar back and have a look at Native California in the late 18th century, just as colonization was beginning with the Spaniards. And if you look at this map, if you can read the small print, you've got amazing eyesight. But the point of this whole thing is that the indigenous peoples in California, there were at least 100 distinct linguistic groups. There were hundreds and hundreds of different sorts of tribes, village-based tribes, and village-based bands. So this was an extremely complex place. These cultures had been around since as much as 12,000 years ago. They were highly developed. And also, what is so curious about California is that it had the heaviest density of indigenous peoples of any American territory or state, bar none. Before the Spaniards came in 1769, the carrying capacity of California is estimated to have been about 300,000 people. And that's based on how much food was here. And it's basically California, for the most part, is a fairly easy place to make a living. There's a lot of food here. And the particularly densest populations were right along the coast, from Los Angeles up, and particularly around the Bay Area. These were very, very dense populations of very distinct groups of people. The whole kind of almost the prologue for what happened in the genocide under America, the United States, is really the Spanish and then Mexican mission system. And this was as you probably understand, it was this chain of emissions running from Sonoma all the way down into what is now San Diego. And it was used as the outpost by first the Spanish Empire and then the Mexican state to occupy the coastal California and largely indenture all the native people there to work on the farms and ranches that were owned by the missions. It was an absolutely disastrous system for Indians. The indigenous population just in the coastal area of California has been estimated to have been about 65,000 in 1769 when the Spaniards got here. And it was down to as low as 18,000 by 1832 when the Mexicans secularized the missions, took them away from the church, and then distributed the lands. That's a decline of more than 75%. So this was an enormous disaster. But it raises a big question. Was the mission system genocidal? And the answer is no, not in terms of the 1948 UN Convention. For all the damage that they did, the Spaniards and the Mexicans did not intend to wipe out California's indigenous people. Rather, they wanted to create a colonial workforce that they could use to make themselves wealthy. And they used violence and effective enslavement to get what they wanted. They did have a very casual attitude about Indian mortality, because they figured if you began running out of workers, you could always go back in the hills and dragoon some more. But so this period under and it basically didn't care how many people died. I mean, that's really what it came down to. And since they were baptizing all these folks, some of the padres actually saw it as they were doing a benefit to the Indians, because if they died baptized, then they went to heaven. So they had it was a crime against humanity, according to current international law, but it wasn't really a genocide. This began to change in 1846, and that's when Commodore John D. Sloat landed at Monterey and claimed California for the United States. The military governors who took over after Sloat, up until the state became a state in September of 1850, were at pains to maintain the indentured labor system that was being used throughout the state, because it maintained the whole economy. So actually, the curious thing is that the California Indians were important to that operation. They were the fundamental labor force. And so it was obviously kept the Indians on the bottom. They didn't have any land rights. They had no title, but they were needed. And so and to that extent, they were somewhat protected. But this really began to change in 1848 with the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill. And all of a sudden, the coastal towns in California just emptied out overnight. And the whole flood of fortune seekers coming into the state caused a huge demographic change. So in 1846, as you can see, non-native people were outnumbered 10 to 1. Excuse me. Non-native people were outnumbered 10 to 1. That began to change extraordinarily rapidly. As you can see, by 1850, the non-natives were far more of them than there were of native people. And it kept getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And of course, with every single immigrant coming into California, first to exploit the gold, then later to do things like timber and farming and ranching and so forth, Indian labor became less and less necessary. And at the same time, the attitudes among Americans were really shifting. More and more Americans were beginning to believe at this time, or this is right around the turn, right in the middle, of the 19th century, 1850. More and more Americans were believing that their march across North America was due to the innate superiority of Anglo-Saxons, who were destined first to use African Americans as slaves and then to remove natives from land that was rightfully theirs. And increasingly, the scientific, political, and even religious establishment came to accept inherited and unalterable racial differences as empirical fact. By 1850, there was the notion of a racial hierarchy, with whites on the top, of course, and natives on the bottom. And it made the extinction of indigenous peoples essentially a biological fact that was unalterable. It was just going to happen. This idea got even into school textbooks. So these people coming into California are carrying these ideas of manifest destiny and this kind of hierarchical racism and white supremacy. And they're flooding into a place with extreme speed. There's no other state in the United States that was settled as rapidly and as fiercely as California was. It was just an explosive kind of colonization that brought people in. And so all this set up this is a manifest destiny, excuse me. It set up Peter Burnett's comment in 1851 about exterminating Indians. There's this crush going on between a large native population, very dense, holding the land, and this incoming number of Americans being added to day by day by day by day, who want the very land the Indians are on. You'll notice that in this statement, Burnett wraps himself in this notion, this kind of pseudoscientific idea that Indians are going to become extinct anyway, so why don't we just speed it up? It's going to happen no matter what, so we can make it faster if we want to. This was a very widespread idea. You can see from this quotation from the Yreka Mountain Herald that it's the same fundamental idea that the extermination is simply going to happen anyway. Let's go ahead and do it. And Yreka at that time was, right now, it's a really dying town on Interstate 5, not too far from the Oregon border. But in this time, it was a very prosperous gold mining town. And this is not an outlier. Just check this out, this particular quotation from the New York Times in December of 1855, which is definitely more urbane and better written, yet it basically it embraces the same basic notion that Indians are going to be exterminated, period. We might as well just go ahead and do it. And this was what made this also really bad, or what kind of added to the whole difficulty, was that in the early 1850s, there was an effort by the federal government to get treaties signed with California tribes. And they set a commission of 3 men who signed 18 treaties with 119 California tribal signatories that created reservations that would have given 7.5 million acres of this state over to the tribes. At first, this seemed like a great idea, but very soon, California's political leaders were realizing they were giving away a lot of real estate, and the real value in California was the real estate. So they got the US Senate to repudiate all the treaties in July 1852. The treaties were actually hidden in a secret archive where they were not discovered until 1905. As a result of this, and there were several military reservations put up to protect Indians, but there was only 125,000 acres. And actually anybody from the outside could come in and grab Indians off the reservation. The Army would make no attempt to protect them. So it was a very bad situation. And all along, at the same time that there's this land title that the tribes might have had was being denied them, there was a rise in ongoing violence against the tribes. This is one of the exemplars of this is what happened up around Clear Lake. And in 1850, there were 2 local ranchers who were killed by their tribal workers who were really slaves on their ranch because of a damage they had done to a horse. They killed this guy and then took 2 guys, and they took off for the hills. And the Army and a variety of vigilantes and other militias went out after the Indians. And in response for these, or in retribution for these 2 killings, the Army and the militias killed at least 1,000 Indians all around Clear Lake, all the way down through the Russian River Valley. And the bloodiest of these particular massacres happened here at Clear Lake, in a place called Bloody Island. And there's anywhere between 60 to 800 folks were killed here, depending on what source you read. Never was an accurate count. If you take the high end of 800, that places Bloody Island among the most lethal massacres in American history, and ranking up right up there with infamous incidents like Wounded Knee and Sand Creek. And this is only one example of the mass killing that was becoming more and more the stock in trade all across Northern California and throughout the central, right where the gold fields were particularly, was where these kinds of killings were happening. And one thing to keep in mind, though, lest we only see the tribes as victims, is that they did fight back. I mean, they fought back. But you had an absolutely imbalanced kind of military setting, because here you have cannons, rifles, and pistols being set against bows, arrows, and spears. So it was a no contest. And the explosive influx of settlers into California caused enormous amounts of environmental damage because of the placer mining, the market hunting, and the large-scale livestock grazing that was going on. And that removed many of the traditional food sources and put indigenous nations on the ropes. So they often turned to rustling, stealing cattle and horses for food, and in order to feed themselves, and that would then set off a new wave of retribution. So hungry Native people driven into the hills at trying to find food, rustle cattle, they are then that rustling of cattle creates an occasion for violence against them. And it just keeps going round and round and round and round. And this is a map from the Oakland Museum that shows some of the key massacre sites in California, those red dots. And each one of these is a place where there was a large killing of people. Large number of people were killed, at least in the number, several dozens. One thing you can really notice about this really strikes me, is the way that these killings did not happen in places where there was a fairly dense settler population, like San Francisco, Los Angeles, Sacramento. They happened more back in the hinterland. And so, as a result, there were very few observers and eyewitnesses, apart from the people who were actually doing it. And all the time this is going on is that this is a campaign not only to exterminate Indians as living, breathing people, but also to eliminate their presence and somehow turn them into something other than human. And this man played a role in that, and that's the Army Army Assistant Surgeon General George Otis. In 1868, Otis put out an order requiring military medical officers to build the collection of indigenous skulls at the Army Medical Museum in Washington, D.C. The purpose, Otis said, was, quote, to aid in the progress of anthropological science by obtaining measurements of a large number of skulls of the Aboriginal races of North America. It should be noticed it was almost never used for this purpose. The skulls were collected in various ways, like grave robbing, picking up the dead during plagues and epidemics, and executions and battles. This is a photo from the Klamath Falls newspaper that shows 4 skulls taken from 4 men hanged at the end of the Modoc War. Whenever I look at this photo, I absolutely get the creeps. These were 4 men hanged supposedly for a series of killings during the war. And after they were hanged, they were decapitated. The heads were preserved and sent on a train in a barrel marked specimens of natural history to the Army Medical Museum. And there they finished up the preservation of them and put those numbers on the frontal bones to identify them. This was part of the collection at the Army Medical Museum that grew to over 2,200 skulls in time. And it marks the United States as the only nation ever to collect human skulls as official government activity. One of those things to keep in mind. Meanwhile, so we have the physical killing of Indians. We have their being made into sort of nostalgic museum artifacts. The curious thing is there are also a lot of place names across California to this day that carry the names of perpetrators of the genocide. Names like Kelseyville, Kelsey Creek, Kelsey Court. Excuse me. Kelsey was one of the 2 slaveholding ranchers who was killed up in Clear Lake. So, and he was a really nasty guy. Same thing is true of Larrabee Creek in Humboldt County. Larrabee organized the killing of almost all the Wiyot people at a place called Indian Island near Yreka. And then, of course, there's Burnett Avenue, which is named after Peter Burnett. Then there's the Hastings College of the Law, which has since been renamed. And that was named after Serenus Hastings, who actually organized a private militia to kill off Indians in his land holdings up around in Eden Valleys, up in northern Sonoma County, Mendocino County. And the same thing with the names Jarbo and Kibbe. They were both militia leaders. So these names they kind of preserve the memory of the perpetrators of a genocide. What's also happened is that many of the landmarks in the state of California that once had indigenous names have been renamed. There's just absolute freaking dozens of these kinds of places. Since I lived near Mount Diablo, this one always stands out for me. Mount Diablo is a name that came from the Mexicans. But this particular mountain had its own series of indigenous names. And those, of course, have been lost, and the name is known by one of the colonizers' names. So it's once again, you see that the reality of these people is being exterminated from the land, or wiped out, erased from the landscape. Renaming objects like this, I mean, landscape landmarks, is one of those things that helps to turn Indians into the sort of nostalgic object of loss. And that's where Ishi comes in. Since we talked about Kroger earlier a little bit, Ishi walked out of the backcountry near Orland in 1911 after hiding out for 40 years in that part of the state. And he was cast as a leftover from a lost and extinct people, the Yahi, who were one of the subgroups of the Yana, and not a survivor of an exterminated one. That's the important part, is they were a vanishing people, not an exterminated people. And this turned him into a romantic figure whose existence elicited sweet nostalgia for a lost age, as opposed to shame and guilt over the genocidal violence to which his people had been subjected. He was by no means the only last, quote, member of any particular California tribal group. It's a phenomenon that was repeated over and over in the 20th century. This is a story from Yosemite Nature Notes about the last Awanichi. The Awanichis were the people who had occupied Ahwahnee, which is the original name for Yosemite Valley. And they were wiped out, and the survivors moved out of Yosemite Valley in the early 1850s. But in fact, these people had survived. Here was one. She was not a last link by any means, or a last member. The curious thing about all this, and I want to get, is that is the discovery, not the discovery, but the understanding that despite all this killing, disease, cultural erasure, and so forth, California Native people are still here. In 1900, there were only about 15,000 of them. As of the 2020 census, the number of people who live in this state who are identified as Native American or Alaska Natives is 1.54 million. That is the largest absolute or indigenous population in any US state or territory, not percentage-wise. It's much higher, say in Alaska, where it runs around, it's about 20, 25%, or in states like the Dakotas or Arizona. Still, we have the largest absolute number of Native people in this state. 16% of all Native Americans and Alaska Natives reside inside California. But only 3% live on tribal lands. You can see here that this is the entire extent of tribal land in the state of California. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for this. Given the large population, one of the biggest ones is that because those treaties that were signed in the 1850s were never honored, no land was set aside early on or I should say no land, relatively little land was set aside. And many of the smaller reservations were not even set up until the 20th century, the little ones called rancherias. And that's, so that we've got this situation in California now where there are a large absolute number of Native people. Not very many live on tribal land. And we also curiously have a large number of people whose tribal affiliations come from outside the state of California, because they moved here, just like a lot of Americans did, for better job opportunities, better climate, so forth. In fact, if I remember correctly, the largest number of people in the state, largest tribal affiliation is Cherokee, who of course mostly came from the Southeast and then from Oklahoma, and then a large number moved here too. there's a rising power and presence of Native people, not only from these numbers, but as you probably noticed from the news here and there, things like casino law, which has had a lot of effect in Indian country of getting much more money in, and there's an increasing amount of land back movement going on. And it's important that this has set up the situation in which the state of California has begun to recognize that the reality that this state had a genocide and needs to do something about that fact. And Jerry Brown actually established the Office of the Tribal Advisor, which has now become a whole department within the government of tribal affairs. And he actually invited Benjamin McNally, the author of American Genocide, to talk in the Capitol to tribal leaders and to legislators and state administrative leaders. And then in June 2019, Gavin Newsom acknowledged the reality of the genocide in a gathering of tribal leaders and apologized for it. And this is the first time that an American governor ever apologized for a statewide atrocity against its native peoples. And it's important, if you'll notice the guy standing on Newsom's left, that's James C. Ramos, who was the first Native Californian to be elected to the state assembly. And he did a traditional bird song as a blessing to set this meeting off. Now, this was a very big deal, but it's still only a small beginning. There is now a California Truth and Healing Council that is ongoing. It was formed under the executive order that formalized Governor Newsom's apology, and it's fashioned after the South African and Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. Is charged with documenting the relationship between the state of California and its tribal citizens, and it has a deadline of January the 1st, 2025 for a full report and an action plan. So this is a story that's still unfolding. And I think when that comes up, that's going to be a big piece of news. I'm going to wrap up just by taking some lessons from the California genocide. I think the first one is important to me is that genocide doesn't work. I mean, here was this huge effort to exterminate the native peoples of California, and it didn't, they're still here. And in fact, there's more native people by far living here now than there were. The other one is that direct violence is only one killer. If you do the math on 1846 to 1873, which is when Benjamin McNally does it, there were about 120,000 fewer Indians in 1873 than there were in 1846. He only accounts for about 9,500 of them killed in various massacres, vigilante, and militia actions. So what happened to the rest of them? Well, they were destroyed by forced labor, malnutrition, disease, and despair. And those forces continued after the violence was over, and they kept killing. So it isn't just a matter of how many people were gunned down. It's what happened to the whole group of indigenous nations. It's important, too, to recognize that democratic institutions and constitutional checks and balances do not of themselves prevent genocide or any other kind of mass atrocity, be it a war crime or a crime against humanity. And I think this is a really important lesson. If you look at our current time, when there's white supremacists and various forms of white nationalists and Christian nationalists are enjoying increasing political power and coming up with ways to use democratic institutions to further their goals. I take this as a warning. It's a very loud warning bell. And finally, when it's over, it is not over. Repercussions of the genocide are ongoing to this day. I mean, can think of how far it was from 2019 when Gavin Newsom apologized to 1873 when the genocide is sort of has its closing bookend. The repercussions of this are continuing now, and they keep on going. And there's something we're going to have to figure out how to deal with and somehow ameliorate. And this is an ongoing challenge for the state of California. So with that, I would like to. What do I do here? Here we go. As you look at my sales pitch, I'd like to open it up for questions and comments, reflections, fact, fancy, relevant, or irrelevant?